My guest today is a very controversial figure. Dr. Charles Murray is the F.A. Hayek Chair Emeritus in Cultural Studies at the American Enterprise Institute, the co-author of The Bell Curve. He has been physically assaulted when he has tried to give speeches by leftists. He is routinely called a white supremacist and a bigot and all kinds of things. The difference between me and the left on this is I've actually read his books. And while I have misgivings about some of the things he says is fine, I'm convinced that he's a man of goodwill and not a bigot at all. However, his new book, Facing Reality, Two Truths About Race in America, is really quite shocking. And so I wanted to bring him on and let him explain it to you, and you can make up your own mind. Charles, are you there?
I am there.
All right. I can hear you. I can't see you now, but hopefully they'll bring you up. So you open up Facing Reality by saying that you're writing the book to counter the left's obviously ridiculous accusations of systemic racism in America. And here's one of the opening sentences in the book. You say, of the many facts about race that are ignored, two above all, long since documented beyond reasonable doubt, must be brought into the open. The first is that American whites, blacks, Latinos, and Asians as groups have different means and distributions of cognitive ability. Now, I read Human Diversity, and I have to say it sounded like a fancy way of saying that blacks are not as intelligent on average as whites. So what are you saying?
I'm saying that when you give mental tests, whether they are IQ tests or whether they're tests of reading and writing or history or anything else, you name it, there is a consistent, substantial difference between whites and blacks, between Asians and whites, and there's a difference also between Latinos and other groups. These are group means. And Andrew, the thing that is hardest for me to get people to realize is that you can have a difference in means between two groups, but that doesn't sort them into separate bins. These are overlapping distributions, to use the jargon, or put it more simply, millions of blacks are smarter than millions of whites. And if you start from that point and say, yeah, there's a difference in means, I think you have a much different appreciation of the importance of knowing about it. It is not because looking at a person and seeing the color of their skin tells you how smart they are. It does not. But if you are talking about large social consequences, educational outcomes, occupational outcomes among groups, you will see differences that are rooted in the difference in mean cognitive ability.
And are you convinced, I mean, when the Great Migration started and blacks started coming up from the South to the North, they took intelligence tests, and a lot of Northern blacks were smarter than Southern whites, and Southern blacks were less smart, you know. So are you sure that these results are not just cultural artifacts that can be gotten rid of by cultural means?
No, and actually, Andrew, one of the other things that I say in the book that I want people to focus on is this is one case where the causes are not really important. For one thing, the black-white gap narrowed substantially for people born before the early 1970s. And I attribute that narrowing entirely to changes in culture and environment for the better. But that's not the issue now. Suppose that the remaining difference, which has been pretty constant for the last 30 years, is entirely cultural. Just assume that. That does not make any difference when you are looking at educational outcomes and occupational outcomes as of the end of August 2021. The difference exists for whatever reasons, and the existence of the difference has social consequences. We have to talk about them for a very simple reason. The critical race theorists are basically saying, well, look, we had the Civil Rights Act almost 60 years ago, and look at these disparities in educational outcomes and the number of senior managers at Microsoft that still exist. What else can it be except racism? And if you are going to counter that, if you're going to say, well, there are explanations other than racism, and it is related to the difference in mean cognitive ability, that what we are looking at with many of these discrepancies, disparities, is to be expected, given the facts on the ground. It's not fun to talk about. It will be misused by the white supremacists. But we've got to somehow get people to realize these allegations of systemic racism are nonsense. That doesn't mean that race is not still a factor in American life. Yes, it is. Is it systemic? No. And that you've simply got to have recognition of these facts if you're going to destroy this pernicious ideology called critical race theory.
Now, it is a pernicious ideology, and you and I are completely on the same page. I mean, the left hasn't said anything true really since Marx. I mean, since there's been a left. But at the same time, you talk, for instance, in human diversity, a lot about genetics and a lot about the interactions between people, and yet we do see things. I mean, I wonder if there's a danger of discouraging in attacking critical race theory, but is one thing, but isn't there a danger of discouraging things like the Success Academy charter schools, which have eliminated, it seems, the differences between their mostly black students and other white students in other schools? In other words, shouldn't we be talking about ways of narrowing this gap, or should we not?
Yeah. Okay. Andrew, in the absence of what is now the predominant ideology of the administration in power, in the absence of that, yeah, we can focus exclusively on how can we use the success academies and others. How can we expand that, make the public schools more responsive? Yeah, that would be wonderful. We don't have that option because, well, we've talked so far about education and cognitive ability, but in that and also in matters of policing, the charges of racism and white privilege and the degree to which whites are evil and all the rest of that are poisoning the system. And we are not going to be able to scale up the successes of Success Academy until we first face reality, which is where the title of the book came from.
Because Facing Reality, Two Truths About Race in America. But I just want to make sure I understand what you're saying, because the attacks on you, I mean, I read, preparing for this interview, I read an article in the Times Literary Supplement, which is usually a highly intellectual venue by a critical race theorist, that was basically invective disguised as, a criticism. I mean, it was just basically making accusations against you with no basis whatsoever. So I just want to make sure that I understand what you're saying, because your books can be dense. They're dense with information. You do seem to rely a lot on genetics. And one of my problems with genetic thinking is my problem with all materialist thinking is that it falls prey to the logical fallacy that whatever is must be, okay? And so we've seen over time that races change. I mean, the Jews in Russia are a criminal class, essentially, but they come to America and they're successful. The Irish are treated like the blacks in Britain, but they come to America and again, successful. The barbarians who took over Rome built Europe. And so we see that things change. And what I'm trying to ask you, I guess, is do you believe that the differences in cognitive ability between the races are baked into the system, or are they things that we should be addressing? And if we address them, can we get rid of the disparity?
Point number one, Andrew, have me on again sometime and we'll talk about human diversity.
Okay.
First, I'm delighted you read Human Diversity. It pretty much sank without a trace. It was not reviewed by the major publications. I have my own theories about that. And it's a very interesting conversation that what we're learning about genetics, not just with regard to cognitive ability, but all sorts of other traits, we could have a fascinating conversation about that. It is not relevant to the existence of differences now. Let me turn to the policing issue. Maybe I can make the easier there. Okay, let's say that the black-white difference in violent crime rates, which is the second truth in the book,
right,
that I refer to. Let's say that is entirely culturally determined. That's entirely environmental. Okay, fine. If you are a cop, a professional, well-trained, well-meaning guy or gal, and you are in a low-income black neighborhood, you are facing an environment, a policing environment that is dangerous, much more dangerous than the environment in a middle-class white neighborhood. And your appropriate professional response is going to be different in that environment than it is in the white suburban class neighborhood. It's not systemic racism. It is professional police acting responsibly, but responding to an environment which, for whatever reasons, is different in black neighborhoods from white neighborhoods. So, should we do everything to get rid of the difference in black-white crime rates? Absolutely. Can we blame, well, let me say one thing. Videos of cops shooting people in the back as they walk away, that's a criminal act. That's a criminal act that needs to be prosecuted.
Right, of course.
But they're way outnumbered by decisions that have to be made in split seconds, where lives are at stake, and are mistakes made? Yeah. But do they represent racism? Not necessarily. And do differences in other kinds of police behaviors reflect racism? No. So we're saying two things at the same time. We leave open the possibility that the black-white difference in violent crime is entirely environmental. And we also say that differences in policing in black and white neighborhoods now are not the result of racism. And I could say the same thing if I'm an employer and I'm interviewing candidates for a job. Whatever the causes of the difference may be, I'm going to have a lot more candidates for high-level programming jobs from Asians especially, but also from whites, than I am from blacks, because the educational pipeline is providing many more of the latter, former kinds of candidates than the latter. That's not racism, and job hiring decisions are going to reflect that difference, whatever the causes may be.
That's totally fair. I completely agree with most of what you just said. But doesn't it matter what you think the causes are? I mean, doesn't it ultimately, when you are a public figure, a scholar, and a genuine scholar, and again, as I said before, I'm absolutely convinced that you're not a racist, that you are operating in goodwill. But doesn't it matter to somebody reading Facing Reality whether you're saying the left is wrong, but there are other cultural reasons for this, or whether you're saying the left is wrong and this is incurable, this is something that can't be changed?
Okay, I've said as often as I'm going to say that no, it doesn't make any difference what the causes are for purposes of this book. Let me say very briefly what we're going to be going through with regard to genetics over the course of the next decade. And Andrew, there is nowhere a greater discrepancy between the conventional wisdom in the chattering classes, in the elites, and what is known by the scientific community in regards to genetics. It is now taken for granted as a consensus among population geneticists who deal in ancient DNA and other things that a great deal of evolution has taken place since humans left Africa. And it is also taken as a consensus that lots of genetic variants have different profiles for different ethnic groups. And by the way, we don't need to use the word ethnic. We can just say populations. We don't need to use the word race. Armenians have different genetic profiles from Welsh. And I can go through any pair of ethnic groups you want to talk about and say that's just an empirical reality. At this point in history, we do not yet know a lot about what those mean for the phenotype. By the phenotype, I mean observable behavior and traits. But we are going to know. And another thing that is broadly accepted by geneticists is that there will be differences among different groups, not necessarily large, but that will exist. And once again, Andrew, that is not genetic determinism. It is saying, do genes have any influence whatsoever on these traits and behaviors? Yes. Is it extremely probable that there are differences, whether they be minor or not so minor, among different ethnic groups? Yeah, that's also going to happen. And it's time we were able to talk about that calmly and rationally and not run screaming from the room.